Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is Marshall Sanders. Welcome back to the White Matrix series, and we're in the steps of reparations. In the spirit of having a good story, or hopefully a story that you would consider good, I would like to make a story about a wealthy woman who was once an heiress. You see, this wealthy woman was a kind hearted woman, but she was rather naive about most of the things in the world. Being a woman of wealth, she understood a lot of things concerning finances and structures of business. However, she didn't understand snake oil sellers. You see, she felt by her doing patriotic work and all kind of work that would help the poor and the needy, she could show her worth and her virtue to everyone. So one day, she was at a particular place working a particular organization that actually helps people find their path back to work. And she met a charming young but poor man, and he was very, very intelligent. He was very nice, and he appeared to be the kind of guy that she thought he'd make a very good husband. Well, lo and behold, within 3 months they were dating, and within an additional month or two, they had decided to get married. Now, the young lady was an heiress, and her parents had suddenly died in a car accident days before. So, in great part in being in grief, she agreed to marry the young man, wanting to be comforted, of course, in such a time of grief. But now, being the heir of a fortune, she and her husband now came together in holy matrimony, or so it seems. You see, within a month, there were all kind of paperwork that needed to be signed. After all, we all know the process of those who have we have lost, and having to deal with documentation with the states and lawyers and such other things. And this woman had exceedingly more things to deal with. And not wanting to deal with these very, very sad issues, her husband was more than willing to help her deal with them. So when it pleased her, he would bring the documents to her and she would simply sign them, trusting that her husband was bringing her the right documents. Less than 6 months later, her husband escorts some police officers into the residence. The police officers looked upon her, who was still grieving for the loss of her parents, and said, "Ma'am, we regret to inform you, but you must leave this residence." Looking up in shock, the woman looked to her husband and she looked to the police and said, "What do you mean I must leave this residence? This is my home. I own it. This is private property." And the police said, "Well, ma'am, we have a request to remove you from this property. You see, your husband is now the legal owner of all this property and has called us to remove you from this property." Well, the woman was astonished. She said, "These things are not possible. My husband would not do such a thing. And number two, I certainly have not been given permission to do so." So the policeman decided to show her all the documentation. And it showed that her husband had tricked her into signing forms which gave him custody of all things, including the wealth of her parents, which happened to also include in part her home. The woman, in absolute shock, was walked out of her own house and her own inheritance that her parents and she had labored for. for 4 generations. So this woman was now homeless, and she was even kicked out of the jurisdiction of the neighborhood because the person that her husband had put a court order for her to be remain outside the jurisdiction, which meant that she had to be outside of roughly 1 square mile away from him. And so this woman is homeless on the street. And to some, there were very generous people who actually helped to feed her. She would come to the restaurant door or to homes and ask for food or clothing or umbrella or some other things. And some were generous, genuinely caring for her, and gave her a place to stay for a night and such other things. But most, nearly all, abused her even more. She was beaten. She had things thrown at her. She was even sexually molested. So her time on the street was not good. And having no money or representations to fight, she still had a fighting spirit. So she would go and take everything she had, and she would go to the court, asking them to hear her court case, to give her property back to her, not her husband. And repeatedly and repeatedly and repeatedly, she was denied. And so she would have to again file the paperwork. Now, the judge was, to say the least, very tired of her. And he began to make sure that he put it in his dissertation how much he really did not like the woman. And many times he even spoke saying, "You were the fool to do this. You are responsible for this." Not even taking into consideration that she was going through sorrow over her own parents and such other things that the conniving, lying husband had done. He simply put the blame on her. And so that was even a double whammy for her when she went to the court to claim her property. But lo and behold, she heard more and more stories about how her husband had gone through her wine collection, priceless amount of wine collection that was well worth $20 million when she had left her estate, and how he had abused everything there, including the maids and such others who had been there for life, how he had brought in many other scoundrels, and how they had abused the place in many ways, and how he was going through her money with all kinds of things that he was doing. The things that had taken up 4 generations to build up, he had gone through it to the point that he was almost there to make her broke. But the woman had one trump card up her sleeve that she had never revealed to her husband. You see, her great-grandfather had been a very, very careful man, having escaped persecution. He had built a way to escape into the castle, or rather the mansion, that they had had before. And she had heard from her dad how to get in and out of the castle, the way they, with no one being a wiser of. So one day, she went in to that secret passage, and knowing that her husband would be drunk, she went into the secret passage and walked up the multiple steps until she reached the top. And that one went into the master bedroom which her husband resided. Coming through the passage, she saw that he was drunk and passed out. So she took him and she tried to raise him to his feet. But he was so passed out. He simply was very little responsive. So she put her put his arms rather on her shoulder and basically picked and dragged him up. And she brought him to the top of the steps of this passage. And just as she brings him to the very, very first step, or the top passage of the steps, he finally opens his eyes in his hazy, glazy, drunk glaze, and recognizes who it is that has him in her arms. And as the realization that she was really there and it wasn't a dream or he wasn't in some kind of fantasy land came into his eyes, his body began to descend down the steps, clunk, 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 until his body arrived at the bottom of those steps. His neck was broken, multiple contusions, and he would be dead within the next hour. And so the woman left the passage open, and she walked over his body and stared down at the man that she had trusted with everything and had taken advantage of her and had no mercy upon her, but just simply taken advantage of her. So she stepped over his body and left quietly through the passage, being careful not to touch anything and keeping everything clean. Well, the next week, she showed up to the court before the same judge who was disparaging and quite unkind to her. And she showed up, and she then made her appeal and her demand to have her property returned to her. Well, the attorneys to another side were, frankly, horrified to see her. Because the judge, wanting to find a completion to the case, said they both need to show up here. And if one shows up, if the woman does not show up, I will frankly remove her from ever filing the case. And if the man does not show up, well, the case will be dismissed for his keeping the property, and she will get her property back. Well, of course, the man never showed up because his body was found the next day. He was dead. And the woman, of course, got her property back. And this time she secured her property. And she made sure that now that she had her property, she would never again be fooled by someone with their honorable words and sweet talking. Now, why did I say that story? I'm keeping with the theme of the white matrix and reparations. You see, there's a lull that comes to people's mind when they think of America. They think of America as the land of the free and home of the brave. Anyone who's studied American history knows that those are two extreme, very extreme words of propaganda, and certainly as far away from the truth as can be imagined. While there are free people in America, and while there are some brave in America, very few meets that qualification. And so, here's the thing. America made its finances mostly in the last 40 years off of the backs of black slaves. This is not disputable. This is fact. And the people of color have been asking for their property and parts of their property for those 400 years or more. And yet we've been denied. We've gone before the judges and the courts and the constitutions and saw the things that we're supposed to do peacefully. And we've been denied. But you see, that which was stolen from us, the person or persons or institutions, are going to come down. They will come down. And they're going to have their day at the top of the steps. And the white matrix is going to be destroyed in itself, in its drunken stupor of power and self-righteousness and lies. It's going to come to the realization that it's coming down, and there's not going to be a rising up again of the white matrix ever again. So we're going to continue on our theme today. I'm going to read you something here, and for reparations that I have to speak on today in very short manner are the reparations for blacks for freedom first. And many of you are saying, well, you've had freedom. Let me read something from you for you. This may sound familiar in part to you, but let's get an idea of what you call freedom and if it's been obtained by people of color or anyone else for that matter. First, we start with the idea that in, I believe, 1609 or 1607, rather, blacks were first starting to be brought over here as slaves. We know that Portugal and Spain and such other ones used slave ships to bring it over here. We're aware of that. However, let's move beyond that. Let me read something for you. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs to stride from land to land. Here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned light, and her name, mother of exiles, from her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridled harbor that twin cities frame. Keep ancient lands your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shores. Send these, the homeless, templars tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. This is a inscription that is found on the Statue of Liberty by Emma Lazarus. Emma Lazarus was a abolitionist who did not believe in slavery, obviously, and was proactive into removing slavery from the shores of America. She was also wise enough to know that America was built on immigration. Or was it? You see, the people whom Emma was representing were people like the Pilgrims who came over peacefully, fleeing the persecution of the white matrix. But unfortunately for the Pilgrims and others, being pursued by the white matrix then came to these shores. But the white matrix didn't simply come to the shores. The white matrix was still even in the shores on which the people had just left. Let me read something else for you. Did you know that the black slaves, once they had been set free, which we both know, as I spoke in yesterday's video, black slaves were not set free. Matter of fact, they simply, with the 13th Amendment, they legalized slavery. I'm going to repeat that again for those who have not watched the other video. The 13th Amendment does not do away with slavery. It literally legalizes slavery and the parameters to which you can have a slave. And so many of those who have had their shackles broken had them put on, had new ones just put on. And sometimes they were even worse than when they were slaves, pun intended. Now, by the time the 1880s had arisen, all of a sudden you started seeing statues raised in America. These statues were of the new Jim Crow legal slavery slaves. As a matter of fact, though most people think that in America these statues were being raised as a monument to history, really is the most ignorant assessment of history there is. Because most of the monuments started going up also in 1950 as a sign of white power, especially Confederate memorials. But what else is new? Now, many of those slaves, seeing the disingenuous nature of the so-called laws of the United States, wanted to return to their African homes that their parents and their grandparents and those who they had any association with wanted to return to in their nostalgia. So they wanted to go back to Africa. However, there was a problem. Africa was being divided by certain nations. Yes, Africa is a continent. And yet a continent was being divided by nations. Interesting thing is, every one of those nations, with the exception of one, was pure, unabashedly, 100% white. And as a point of interest, have you ever noticed that white nations could fight against each other very, very violently sometimes, and yet they'll help each other rebuild each other's nation? Or did you forget that as much as we like to call them Nazis and all the bad things concerning the Germans who had become Nazis at the time, guess who immediately started to rebuild their country? Ah, the United States of America immediately started to rebuild Berlin and Germany, and at the same time destroy Africa. Colonialism at its best. But I digress. There are certain nations that got together in the late 1800s, I believe in 1884. These nations got together in 1884 and they started to divide Africa, which is why Africa is to this day completely destroyed of many nation building efforts that are found in other countries. They literally divided it so that it can stay, so that Africa could stay divided and crushed. These are the nations: Austria-Hungary, Belgium, Denmark, France, Germany, Great Britain, Italy, the Netherlands, Portugal, Russia, Spain, Sweden, Norway, Turkey, and the United States of America. Now, of these 14 nations, France, Germany, Great Britain, and Portugal were the major players in the conference. Let me ask, How many of these major players were slave traders? Now we know that Great Britain had outlawed slavery by 1807, and yet here we are at 1884, and rather than have their hands set in the American slavery or British slavery, all of a sudden they have great interest in establishing the control over blacks in which the slaves have just came from. You see, these nations owe a debt not only to the blacks in this country, but in Africa. So, one part of reparations that I have a demand for are these nations who have been destructive to the black nations, who co-opt colonialism amongst the white nations to take over every property that was controlled or owned by blacks, should also be responsible for paying reparations to those who they stole it from. What do you think? However, let's continue. These nations in which we just spoke on are not the U.S. government. But we know that the U.S. government has done everything it can to destroy blacks in this country and in their original place of being abducted and brought here to slavery, that being the continent of Africa. So, most certainly, the U.S. owes reparations out of its pony. Here's one thing, though, that most people do not know. Did you know that the United States is not a government at all? What do you mean, Marshall? How could you say that the United States is not a government? Well, we started off as a government. We had a constitution. But they changed it. The United States, written in their own law, is a corporation. And as a corporation, the United States is a for-profit corporation. What that means, ladies and gentlemen, is every corporation can be sued, or what you would call a class action lawsuit. And it was the corporations that made all of the finances in the first place. After all, who do you think was selling and distributing and taking all the cotton and such other things that blacks picked in the first place? It was corporations. Therefore, a class action lawsuit could be issued to the corporation of the United States, as well as corporates around the world who benefited from here and there in Africa. Now, someone you would say, oh, that's rather extreme. Why would they? Oh, well, the blacks did not come here on slave ships made by Americans. They were made by other countries who brought them here. And subsequently, they continued the slavery in many of those nations even to today. So, for those of you who are interested in learning more about this history, please let me know. Comment. Please ask. And we'll send you the information that you need. It's definitive information. It isn't information that can be countered by some apologist or someone who's defending the colonialism and the crimes of this nation. It can be proven. Now, we're getting to a part where I really wanted to make clear. I may even slow down my speaking so that my clarity in my voice may be heard. We're at a very trying time in our history. There are people afraid of COVID-19. They're afraid of losing their homes. And when I say people, we're talking black, white, and otherwise. They're afraid of a collapsing economy that has collapsed a long time ago, that they just really have no idea how long we've been broke. They listen to mainstream media and Donald Trump speaks about the greatest economy ever without realizing we've had the worst economy ever for several decades now. But as long as they tell you things to keep you thinking in your white matrix, that your white matrix can endure forever, that you can sit at the table and stay drunk on the labor of others, you're willing to keep yourself drunk on the positioning of the white matrix. But it's crumbling down. Many of you want to go back to sleep and wake up to a Make America Great Again campaign slogan. You want white America back. You want greatest land in the earth. You want a Bruce Springsteen song, Born in the USA. And you're so proud of so many other things. Well, I can certainly say that it has been a good ride. And there's much for people who are living in the white matrix to celebrate and be happy about. Understand that's going to end. And end very soon. And you have a chance to build something now. You have a chance to make past wrongs right and make present wrongs right, so that in the future everything will simply be right, and we will not be trying to undo things. We would simply be putting all of our efforts and times into building something. So I'm going to continue this reparations demands, but to make it clear for you, the reparation demands on this is that things like statues come down. They're not heroes. These statues were made mostly from the Confederate side well after anything could ever think of trying to commemorate these people. They were commemorating a time period of slavery and not any interest in any individual hero or anything else. It was nostalgia of the good old days of when you had slaves to do all the work for you, and you could take all the glory and the money and everything else that they had built legally. So the demand to tear down these statues that are not of heroes on public land, or, as I've mentioned before, sell these statues to those who want to put on their private clubs or private property. If you love them so much, buy them. But let's see how much you love them so much when you have to spend your own money to get them. And if you buy them, great. That money is money that can go right into the hands of those same people that you wanted to remind yourself was once slaves to you. I say, add it to the money for reparations or anything else that would give it back to those people who were victims of the white matrix. I will have my next breakdown as soon as possible on reparation demands. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Have a wonderful day.